If you enjoy the content on this channel, please like and subscribe. The Bounty is a 1984 British epic historical drama film directed by Roger Donaldson. It is the fifth film version of the story of the mutiny on HMS Bounty, with Robert Bolt's screenplay adapting the 1972 book Captain Bligh and Mr. Christian by Richard Hough. It stars Mel Gibson as Fletcher Christian and Anthony Hopkins as William Bligh, with supporting roles played by Laurence Olivier, Daniel Day-Lewis, Liam Neeson and Edward Fox. The Bounty began production in late 1978 under director David Lean as a long-term passion project, but multiple complications, including a prohibitively high budget and screenwriter Robert Bolt suffering from a heart attack, led to a period of development hell that ended with the hiring of newcomer director Donaldson. Filming took place primarily on location in Donaldson's home country of New Zealand, French Polynesia and England. The film was made by Dino De Laurentiis Productions and Bounty Productions Limited and distributed by Thorn EMI Screen Entertainment in the United Kingdom and Orion Pictures Corporations internationally. It premiered on May 4, 1984, to generally positive reviews. It was entered into the 1984 Cannes Film Festival, where it was nominated for the Palme d'Or. The film was noted by critics and historians as being more historically accurate depiction of the mutiny than previous depictions. Donaldson, who was an Australian who had forged a career as a director in New Zealand with Sleeping Dogs and Smash Palace, the latter was the first New Zealand film to obtain a distributor in the United States. Donaldson said he met with De Laurentiis to discuss filming a sequel to Conan the Barbarian. Donaldson would say, "Sometime during that period I mentioned that I thought The Bounty sounded like an interesting project. The producer then offered him The Bounty, despite not having seen any of the director's films, and the fact that his biggest budget to date had been $1 million. Donaldson would say, "Making the movie was something that initially I wasn't sure I wanted to do. I thought it might be perceived as some sort of remake, but I looked at it and decided I'd do it as long as I could do something completely on my own, not a remake at all, but based much more on fact, something to set the record straight. I saw it as an intense personal drama about two friends who have a tragic and violent falling out, a drama in which your sympathies change as events change," Donaldson would later say. "When you leave the movie, I hope deep down you feel that you've understood a relationship between these two men." Anthony Hopkins was one of two actors considered for the role of Captain Bligh by David Lean, the initial director. The other, of course, was Oliver Reed. Hopkins was then approached in early 1978. In April of 1980, when David Lean was still attached, Christopher Reeve was favoured to play Fletcher Christian. Lean had enjoyed Superman, and Katharine Hepburn had recommended Reeve to Lean. "It's not a remake," said Reeve. "The other versions were just remakes of the first movie. This is the true story based on the diaries of those actually on the Bounty and from the trials of the mutineers. It's the best screenplay I've ever read and would be an honour and a privilege to accept the part of Christian." Reeve stayed on the project throughout the change in director. However, he dropped out at the last minute and was then replaced by Mel Gibson. Gibson was looking for a project after The Night of the Running Man at MGM was cancelled. He said, "I liked the idea that they were going to show Bligh and Christian as the young men they were. I also liked the idea of playing a role that Errol Flynn first attempted." The role of Peter Hayward, who inspired the character of Roger Byam in the novel and earlier versions, was originally intended to be played by Hugh Grant. Tiavati Venetti was spotted at Papian Airport and offered the female lead. She had to be persuaded and only agreed to play the leading role when filming had begun. Filming started on April 25, 1983, and the final script was only completed a day before the filming began. A replica of the Bounty used in the film was built in Whanganui, New Zealand, before the script was even completed, at a cost of $4 million, and the entire film cost $25 million. Donaldson said filming on the ship was hard. It was only 90 feet long, and its design was archaic, he would say. "So it rolled all the time, and people were constantly seasick. It wasn't a very pleasant experience." Mel Gibson described the making of the film as difficult because of the long production time and bad weather. He would say, "I went mad. They would hold their breath at night when I went off. One night I had a fight in a bar, and the next day they had to shoot only one side of my face because the other side was so messed up. If you see the film, you can see the swelling in certain areas." Anthony Hopkins, who battled with alcoholism until becoming abstinent in 1975, was worried about Gibson's heavy drinking, saying, "Mel is wonderful, wonderful fellow with marvellous future. He's already something of a superstar, but he's in danger of blowing it unless he takes hold of himself." Gibson, who likewise self-identified as an alcoholic, agreed with his concern and added his admiration for the Welsh actor, saying, "He was terrific. He was good to work with because he was open and willing to give. He's a moral man, and you could see this. I think we had the same sort of attitude." Donaldson said Hopkins became Bligh during filming, so much so they didn't want to sit with him during breakfast. Donaldson admits he and Hopkins clashed quite a lot during filming. "I'm a bit of a hard taskmaster," admitted Donaldson later. "I won't give up until I really think we've wrung everything out we can from a scene. It was 90 degrees in Tahiti and the humidity was 100%, and Tony was wearing his wool serge uniform done up to the neck. That was very demanding just physically." The main score was composed by famed composer Vangelis. The first version, an Australian silent film, Mutiny on the Bounty, was made in 1916. The second, In the Wake of the Bounty, in 1933, and was another Australian production starring Errol Flynn in his film debut portraying Fletcher Christian. The third and most famous version, Mutiny on the Bounty in 1935, stars Charles Langton, Clark Gable, and Francois Tone. The fourth, a remake of the third film released in 1962, starred Marlon Brando, Trevor Howard, and Richard Harris. The 1984 film is generally regarded as more revisionist and as well a more historically accurate depiction of the mutiny than two earlier film versions. Unlike earlier versions of the film, it does not portray Bligh as the villainous character. According to Gibson, it was kind of a fresh look at Captain Bligh, and I think all the renditions of who Bligh was, and this was probably the closest. His Bligh was stubborn, and he didn't suffer fools, but he was brilliant and just had a lot of bad luck. Bligh is portrayed as a man on one hand takes his sense of discipline and command too far, exceeding the limits of the ship's company, but whose character ultimately successfully projects his loyal non-mutineers and guides their overcrowded boat to safety. The Bounty also paints a far less heroic portrayal of Christian. In Gibson's description, Fletcher was just a lad of 22 and he behaved like one. The first time he decided to test his horns and fight for his herd, it was a mistake. He shouldn't have done it. Gibson later expressed the opinion that the film did not go far enough in correcting the historical record. The film also portrays the sailors exploiting the islanders. Unlike earlier film versions, the native women are shown accurately, totally bare-breasted. Gibson said it was completely a culture shock and was unbelievable to them. It was a paradise in terms of personal freedoms that shouldn't have been taken advantage of. They exploited the people, fooled them, and they didn't tell them the whole truth. Gibson chose to suddenly erupt into violent emotion during the mutiny scene because eyewitness accounts had described Christian as extremely agitated, sweating and crying. Some interesting historical facts. When Fletcher Christian returns to Tahiti after the mutiny, he informs King Tyner that they have set Captain Bligh adrift. In real life, Christian lied to Tyner, telling him that Bligh had met up with Captain Cook, with whom he was helping set up a new settlement, and that they had sent Christian back to Tahiti for men and supplies. After Bligh, an exhausted loyalist, make it to Kupang, Smith, played by John Sessions in the movie, collapses after the stepping off the launch. Several of the men who accompanied Bligh did in fact die after arriving in the Dutch East Indies. There is a persistent but unsubstantiated rumour that the real Fletcher Christian did not die in Pitcairn Island, but made it back to England. Several of his relatives later swore that they had spoken with him and that he lived out the rest of his life in hiding. Captain William Bligh's later career was peppered with further mutinies and complaints about his oppressive attitude. His tyrannical nature later sparked the Rum Rebellion in New South Wales in 1808, which led to him being forcibly deported. The film does not state the fate of those men left in Tahiti. There were 16 men, 2 of them were later killed, Churchill, who played by Liam Neeson in the film, and a man named Thompson, who was in turn killed in revenge by native Tahitians. Those remaining 40 men were seized later by HMS Pandora, whose skipper, Captain Edward Edwards, made no distinction between the mutineers and loyalists. Later, when the Pandora floundered on the Great Barrier Reef, 4 prisoners drowned. Those who survived eventually ended up in Britain and brought before a court-martial. 4 were acquitted. The remaining 6 were found guilty of mutiny, 2 of whom later received royal pardons, and 1 of them had conviction overturned. The remaining 3, Bucket, Ellison and Millward, were all hanged. Though the movie shows the mutineers asking for and receiving women and men to take them with them, only some were knowing and willing participants. Many of their consorts were tricked into joining them to party on the ship, which set sail away from Tahiti secretly. One significant historical event which is completely omitted from this movie is the initial attempt by Fletcher Christian and the mutineers to find a colony on the island of Tubai, south of Tahiti. Christian landed on Tubai shortly after the mutiny, and after finding nearly 3,000 hostile natives, established a fort on the northern side of the island, using weaponry from the Bounty. After nearly 2 months of constant skirmishes with natives, Christian and the mutineers abandoned the island, only then returned to Tahiti for more men and supplies before heading eastwards towards Pitcairn. Thomas Burkitt, who had been severely wounded by the Tupain fighting natives, stayed behind in Tahiti. Even though he was clearly a mutineer and would have been hanged if ever found by the Royal Navy, Burkitt was in fact captured and executed for mutiny. Now, as a great lover of history, I found this film absolutely fascinating, captivating, and really enthralling. The performances are absolutely stunning here, from the wonderful Anthony Hopkins here as Captain Bligh to a very interesting performance here from Mel Gibson as Fletcher Christian. Also, just seeing the likes of a young Daniel Day-Lewis, a Liam Neeson, or of course the wonderful Laurence Olivier in one of his final performances, really just adds to the gravitas of this fantastic film. The film's production values, including the detailed recreation of the ship and the period costumes, were also fantastic. I really appreciated the film's focus on character development and the psychological aspects of the mutiny. The tension also between the characters, particularly the conflicting leadership styles of Christian and Bligh, was really highlighted and a real strong point of the film. Overall, in my research, I found this film to be very historically accurate. Look, of course, like any sort of Hollywood drama, it does take certain liberties with historical accuracy for dramatic effect. Look, though, for me, this is an intelligent and engaging piece of filmmaking that really highlights one of the most complicated historical stories from life at sea. With its superb acting performances here, particularly from Anthony Hopkins and Mel Gibson, its excellent direction and overall historical accuracy, The Bounty gets a 9 out of 10.